us something about you, where you are from and what you are doing.
Sure. So my name is Francois Baylis. I'm a university professor in Canada at Dalhousie University. And I've been working on a number of topics to do with women's health and specifically their reproductive health, probably over my career in bioethics. And for a long time I've had an emphasis on reproductive technologies. And because of the changes we've seen recently, that's very quickly moved me into looking at genetic technologies, especially those kinds of technologies that aim to change the way in which we reproduce. So it's been an interesting 30 or 40 years dealing with these topics.
So India is also one of the center of assisted reproduction, huge industry.
Absolutely.
And in the private sector. And I think in China also the similar kind of things are happening. And for the last couple of years they are talking about fiddling with the genes too here. So what you are doing is very, very relevant to India.
Right.
You must have heard about gene editing that was done in China recently. And do you think that the way it was planned and what are and its implication for the clinical medicine and the healthcare in general and public health?
Well, I think there's a lot of interesting things that have happened in the last little while. So, first of all, if I back up just a little bit, I was actually on the organizing committee for the first international summit that took place in Washington in 2015. And this most recent summit, 2018, was held in Hong Kong. And the interesting thing is, I think nothing went according to plan for this second meeting, largely because it was disrupted in a very dramatic way by this public announcement that a scientist in China, in fact, had gone ahead and done genome editing and that there had been the birth of 2 children. And I think this stunned people, partly because it hadn't been done in a way that it was being talked about openly, that people knew this was happening. It also hadn't been published in a peer-reviewed journal, which still is the standard. And even if you don't publish in that context, you would then post it publicly so that it would be available to members of the scientific community to look at the science, but also for civil society, for all of us to be able to think about and reflect on what happened. So I think that what happened there is extremely controversial in terms of the science, but also extremely controversial in terms of what I would almost describe as a disrespect of civil society, that one person takes it upon himself to go about and start making changes to the human genome. And I kind of want to sit back and say, well, who said you could do that? And why would you think you don't have to have the approbation of anybody to go?
But I'm told that the technology has become so simple with the CRISPR technology coming that people can do it in their home,
Well, no, they can't quite do it in their home, but it's true.
Like a bomb making in the home.
You can get the instructions, yes. I think it certainly is relative to previous technologies that people have tried to use for gene editing, typically described as cheaper, easier, more accurate, etc. So it has definitely revolutionized the way people even begin to think about what would be possible. But I mean, it still is, technically difficult, and there are still, potential negative consequences. And we've already seen that with these 2 children. I mean, there's already talk about, for example, the fact that there's mosaicism. And basically what that means is that some of the cells are demonstrating that the gene editing has taken place, and in other cells they haven't. So, you're already seeing one of the anticipated side effects of this kind of intervention. Now, we don't know what are going to be the short-term or the long-term consequences for these children. And the little bit of information we're getting as it comes out in dribs and drabs suggests that the people who participated may not have fully understood what they were participating in.
But, is there any technology available where you can reverse what you have edited out?
Well, there's certainly a lot of people that imagine that once you have the technology, if it's about cutting and pasting and things go wrong, you'll just do it again and reverse it. I think that's a little bit of a cavalier approach to how you would do science, and we don't just or we shouldn't, maybe we do, we shouldn't just kind of bulldoze ahead, do things and think, well, if we make a mess of it, we'll just undo it later. I don't think that makes sense, especially...
Some people in ethics argue that, using this technology, which may be, transmitted to, next generation,
yes,
is fine if you have a, capacity to reverse it. If you don't have capacity, then ethically it is not justified. When you develop that capacity, you can have it.
I don't think you can ever
That is
really
not-
reverse it. I mean, I would say, first of all, on a philosophical level, I don't think you can reverse it. It's like the idea that you can never step into the same water twice, right? It's also in the context, for example, of deep brain stimulation, which is a completely different technology. You know, when things don't go well, the scientists and the clinicians say, well, then we'll just stop it. We won't have to do this anymore. It's like, but you've put a rod into someone's brain. You can't just pull it out and think you haven't disrupted something. And so I think the same thing is true here. And look at how many cells we have in our body. You think you're going to just be able to go in and undo all of that? So I have to say there's a part of me that thinks it's a little bit science fiction to imagine you could do something that dramatic and then just undo it. Now, if by undo it you mean you stop editing other people, and if by undo it you mean you don't allow these people to reproduce. Which is a restoring to the original. You know, that is what that is being argued. I don't think that's going to be possible.
Anyway, in any case, you know, what has happened raises a larger question, that how should society regulate it? Whether it should be state regulating, scientists regulating, or the, as you said civil society, disrespect to civil society. How does the civil society, you know, regulate this kind of stuff?
Well, so I'm a firm believer that the human genome, even if you think about it metaphorically, belongs to all of us. I understand there's no one such thing that is the human genome, but we understand what we're talking about when we say that. And this particular project is really about taking over the human evolutionary story. It's about changing, as you said, the next generation, the generation after that. And that's in fact the way in which you change evolution. That's a monster project. If you're going to take on that project, I certainly don't think it's for a group of elite scientists, politicians, corporate individuals to abrogate that responsibility for themselves. I just don't think it belongs to them. So I think civil society has something to say, and I think that what's important is that we have an abstract mechanism, and that is this notion of broad societal consensus. So if we go back to the 2015 meeting that took place in Washington, at the end of that meeting, a statement was issued, and in that statement it said very clearly two things. It would be irresponsible to go forward with this kind of technology unless and until, and then there were two criteria, unless and until you've got appropriate evidence of safety and efficacy, unless and until you've got broad societal consensus. And other people are wanting to walk away from that. You know why? Because they've understood that the concept of broad societal consensus is very powerful. It's powerful because what it does is it takes away power from the scientists to determine the future of humanity, and it gives it back to us mere mortals, us humans, us members of the community. We get to have a say. And I think that's critically important. And I think there are ways in which we can think about what it means to start working towards a consensus.
What should be the weight of the voice of vulnerables? Because this technology has a huge potential for eugenics. And these are the vulnerables who may ultimately be weeded out, you know, that...
I mean, that's one of the things that I and my colleagues talk about. We talk about increased risks of discrimination, marginalization, stigmatization. We talk about the potential to have a bifurcation in the human species between the haves and the have-nots. And I think in that context, do you really want to have a situation whereby the rich and the powerful are now able to take that privilege, which is a social privilege, and turn it into a biological privilege by building it into their DNA such that they and their descendants will effectively, over time, have all the benefits, and the rest of us will have what? We already have this great divide we talk about now of the 1%, and we know who we're talking about when we say the 1%, and it isn't you and me.
Yeah.
And I think it's really deeply problematic when we take that 1% and we now imagine it also being entrenched in our biology in a way that just, you know, in perpetuity makes it impossible to imagine a coming together and a more just society.
Shifting little bit, but within the same topic, is you know, you doing the editing of the somatic cells, particularly for therapeutic purposes, where you know, you can design individualized care or the customized care, you know, where that person is suffering from a kind of a non-communicable disease, which is otherwise going to cripple that person for life.
Well,
what can you do there? I mean, is it I mean, forget about gene line editing, perhaps it's too ambitious. But somatic cell, do you think that it is also going to have some social consequences?
Well, I think that when you look at somatic cell interventions, at least from my perspective, it's somewhat more justifiable. And there are a number of reasons for that. One of them is that you can actually get the consent of the individual in front of you. You can explain to them the context. And you can say, look, we have this way of offering you a therapy, which might be an environmental set of changes, or we can offer you these pharmaceuticals, or we can offer you this surgery, or we can offer you this gene editing. In a way, I can see that as part of a range of potential health interventions.
In India, there is a lot of hope raised for, say, thalassemia patients, the sickle cell anemia patients, thinking that, well, they may find some cure for that.
And I think that, in the abstract, that sounds really good, and there's no sort of in principle objection. But having said that, there is a part of me that wants to sort of pull back and say, where do we think we're going with this very expensive technology if we don't commit at the same time to make sure that the people will have access to this technology? So we're talking always about the hypothetical patient. And, if you find a cure for sickle cell, do you think you're going to get it to everybody who needs it? If you find a cure for beta thalassemia, do you think you're going to get it to every patient that needs it? We already have all kinds of therapies that we don't get to the people who need them. And I don't know why we think that all of a sudden that this therapy is going to be any different and all of a sudden we're going to get this to all the people who need it. I think we really need to think about this in the context of very expensive science, which in many cases our tax dollars in lots of different countries are paying for. And at the same time that the governments are willing to give our tax dollars to this science, they're not putting aside equivalent tax dollars to make sure we get it as a treatment. Right. And so one of the things that I've been arguing is that if you're going to invest in this science, and you're going to make your population the venture capitalists, you should make sure they get a return on investment. And right now, the scientific community says the return on investment is we're going to have this great therapy. And I say back, yeah, but what are the chances of me individually getting that great therapy as opposed to those who are already wealthy and powerful getting that great therapy?
But
so I think we need to think about that.
But in your system, like the Canadian system, which is a universal coverage, is it possible that it can garner a huge amount of resources?
I think the reality of it is almost every government-funded healthcare system in the world is already under stress, right? We don't have the ability, well, I mean, we could if we were doing illegal things, but we don't usually just print money, right? And so if you don't print money, it means you've got to take every tax dollar and divide it up. And so some's going to go to pay for roads, and some's going to go for art galleries, and some might go for war efforts, and some will go for healthcare, and some will go for retirement. And what's happening in many countries is that health is taking up a bigger portion of the pie, and that's without us having gone down the path of personalized medicine. And I think that these kinds of technologies are forms of personalized medicine, and I'm just asking questions to the effect of, if we invest in this, what are we not investing in? And that's where I think there's a lot of things we could be doing in terms of public health that would help the whole community, as opposed to investing in these sort of efforts at personalized medicine to get to targeted people. I'm not saying we shouldn't do any of that science. I'm not saying it's not important work. I'm saying we have to ask those questions, and we have to come up with good answers. And right now, I think we're avoiding those kinds of questions. And I'm kind of worried about a bioethics that avoids questions. And we do that a lot. So here's a connected but very different example. We have a problem of overpopulation. And yet we're constantly talking about all these new reproductive technologies to allow individual people to have their biologically related children. We have a lot of children in the world that need parents. But no, we're not going to talk about overpopulation. We're not going to talk about adoption. We're not going to do this. We're going to worry about the latest, greatest technology to make sure that somebody who has the resources will get the child that they want. And that gets us back to eugenics, right? It's not just any child they want. It's a specific child they want.
Oh. Do you think that there are some kind of a human rights for that?
No. I'm absolutely on record saying there is no right to have a child. I don't believe that. Other people will say there is such a right. And my response is, having children is a responsibility. You don't just invent a right and say, oh, I have a right to this. If you have children, what you are hopefully doing is willingly taking on a responsibility to care for another being and to help turn them into a member of our society, to socialize them into what it means to be a good human being. And different cultures will have a different understanding of what it means to be a good human being, but that's what parents try to do. They try to inculcate in their children strong values so that they can become a good member of society. So having children is about responsibilities, and you can't just turn around and say, I've got a right. You might have a want. A want isn't a right.
Well, India had always anti-natalist policies, but if you see what has happened in the last 3 decades, is the rise of the assisted reproduction industry.
Absolutely.
Which is also asserting all the time that infertile couples have a right to have their own genetic child.
Yeah, well, I think that that's a mistake. I really do. I don't.
I mean, we don't have that still. It is in the law.
Right.
As a part of our constitution or fundamental right. But this is what is being asserted all the time.
Sure, but at the same time, in India, you have a robust commercial surrogacy industry.
Absolutely.
And that works on a different principle because there you're not going to have a genetic relationship in all cases to the children. And so one of the things that's really interesting about reproductive technologies is if we have a way of responding to your request in a way that will preserve your genetic connection to the children, we tell you genetics is really important. We can do this great thing called ICSI. Don't worry, we'll take your sperm, we'll push it into that egg, and you'll be the father. And if we can't do that for whatever reason, we say, oh, don't worry about your sperm, it doesn't matter, we'll get you a sperm donor, it'll still be your child, you'll care for it. And we talk out of both sides of our mouth all the time, depending on whatever the facts of the situation are. I'm on record again, and I'll say it now, I think we've made a mistake in reifying the gene. The gene is not what's important in the family. And we know that because of all kinds of times throughout history there have been children that have been reared by people who don't have a genetic connection to those children. Sometimes they've known that because they've adopted the child. Sometimes they haven't known that because there's been infidelity, etc. But what we know is that you can have loving, caring relationships that do not depend on biology.
Right.
And the more you say that biology is important, the more you're undermining other legitimate ways of making families, the most obvious one, adoption. And if I take the example in my country, and a number of other countries, I should say, it's striking to me how much we will invest financially in helping people have children using technology, and we will not invest the same amount of money to help those same people have children not using technological means. So, we'll subsidize in vitro fertilization, we won't subsidize international adoption.
Let's say in India, you are putting a lot of resources in assisted reproduction for fertility. On the other hand, we have one of the highest rate of maternal mortality, where you are not able to provide those women who are actually delivering kids, a proper care. So
Absolutely.
What you are saying is that this kind of technology, both in personalized care as well as in assisted reproduction, is going to increase the inequities in the society, particularly in a country like India where there is a national health services.
Absolutely. I mean, I think that one of the things that bioethics should be doing is calling attention to these discrepancies.
Yeah.
It should also be drawing attention to the fact that we have obligations to make sure that people do have access to the things that they have a right to. And those, in my opinion, are things like things that contribute to survival. So I think you do have a right to food. I think you do have a right to shelter. I think you do have a right to health care. And I think that until you have met those basic needs for everyone, you should be at least open to asking questions about the opportunity costs of the other things you're investing in. Because if you're investing in that, then you have taken the time, the talent, and the resources that could otherwise have gone to something else. And we need to have those hard conversations, and instead we don't. We have a conversation over here about public health, we have a conversation over here about infertility, we have a conversation over here about exploitation, and we don't put all the pieces together and really say, look, you can't both do this and that. It just doesn't make sense. And I think there are ways in which bioethics hasn't done what it needs to do, quite frankly.
Well, I think I'll try to conclude, but I must tell you that bioethics oftentimes in country like India is understood as a highly individualized system, which is kind of a part of the clinical medicine, which is also very individualized. I think what you are talking about is very, very different. You are positing bioethics as a part of the public health, and the larger social concern.
I think it has to address that.
How strong is the current people who are thinking in this manner within the bioethics? How strong are they?
I don't think that there's enough of us. I think that it's...
There are not enough.
No, there's not enough of us. I think there's, for good reasons. I mean, I understand where it comes from historically, but I think there's a lot of attention paid to things that are easier to deal with, like, is that a good consent form?
Yeah.
And then you can look at the consent form and say, oh, you need to rewrite this, or oh, people didn't understand that. Or, you could look at something and say, oh, well, we have, 10 patients who need a liver and we only have one liver. Oh, we have a resource allocation problem. And I think we've done that for a long time. We've trained the next generation with those kinds of case studies. And what we haven't, I think, done enough of is said, let's step back and ask the big question. And to me, the big question is, what kind of world do we want to live in? And that's what bioethics should be asking all the time. Is this the kind of world that we want? And I think that if we were asking that all the time, we would be forced to look at the inconsistencies in what we do. We would be forced to interrogate, how is it that we're spending all of this money to help this couple have this child when we have children here that are unclothed, running around the street, don't have enough food? It doesn't make any sense. And yet we don't do that. We deal with this question over here by itself in isolation, and we deal with this question over here, and we try to do good, I think, in both domains. Yeah. But we don't pull back and say, what kind of world are we living in? A colleague of mine once said many years ago, and I've now seen it repeated, bioethics, fiddling while Rome burns. And I think, we really ought to take that admonition seriously.
Yeah, I think that would be the big leap for the bioethics. Definitely, as a discipline, as a movement at the international level.
I think so, and I think it's one of the ways in which we ought to be able to have a coming together across, high income, middle income, and low income countries. If we're all trying to say, let's build a better world, we all have different problems to put on the table, but at the end of the day, hopefully, you can have a different kind of conversation where you're not trying to look to how do you advantage yourself or how do you respond to your own needs, but the our becomes the human species, the human race, the human family. And I think if you thought about things in that way, you'd spend your energy more effectively.
That's a big challenge for the bioethics and for the humanity. So thank you very much. I think we have connected from a small incident, which was very micro, that happened somewhere in China, and a little bit of gene editing there, and then the larger issue of public health and the society in general. So I think this connection have come out very, very, very well for us.
Well, I hope so, and I hope the common thread is this idea that really what bioethics ought to be doing is looking for a way to empower people so that they can in fact articulate what are their needs, what are their concerns, where are their vulnerabilities. And I think in particular, we need to listen to the voices at the margins. Yeah. And I think when we do a lot of the high-tech science, we kind of don't pay attention to what's on the margins. And
so this will open doors for the developing country bioethics development. Because I think one of the reasons historically it has not developed so well in the marginalized country is that we never face this kind of issues. We face directly public health issues, issues related to equity. And once that becomes part of the bioethics discourse, I think there will be better development and integration of bioethics people from the developing world.
Well, I hope so, because I think that's really the work that needs to happen right now. We are, a country of a world of some 7 billion people, and we really need to think about what are the obligations. Yeah. And I think we also need to understand health more broadly. I think we really need to pay attention to the threats in terms of what's happening with the climate. In terms of potential for nuclear war, devastation, food security, all of those things impact health. And I think we've got to keep broadening our understanding of what our challenges are, so that we can come up with better solutions or better proposals for solutions. How's that?
I think this opens up a lot of good areas for further conversation in future. So thank you very much for coming here and for this discussion, which is very, very relevant, as relevant to Canada as it is relevant to India.
Great.
So
Well, thank you for
very
having
much.
me. I appreciate that.